somebody will stand up for what we want, even though he's not saying so. He's looks like the kind of person who might do it. Actually, it's quite interesting to look at the comparisons that are made. He's compared to Kennedy and to Reagan. I mean, Kennedy and Reagan were media constructions. Reagan particularly. He probably didn't even know what the policies were, but he was a creation of the media, who wasn't particularly popular, incidentally, but they created the image of this wonderful cowboy who saves us, and so on and so forth. The Kennedy administration, they were more in control, but they understood. They were the first ruling group to understand the power of television, and they created a kind of charisma through good public relations. So an image of Camelot, this marvelous place, wonderful things happening, the great president. You look at the actual actions, it was grotesque. He's the president who invaded South Vietnam. He launched a major terrorist war against Cuba. Go on and on. He was responsible for his administration was responsible for the establishment of the Brazilian neo-Nazi dictatorship. Coup took place right after the assassination, but the ground was prepared by the Kennedys. That led a horrible plague of repression over Latin America, and on and on. But the image is there. And imagery is very important when you're trying to control a dissident population. Actually, you know, it's not a fascist country, that's a bad analogy, but the similarity to fascist propaganda techniques is quite striking. And it's not accidental. The Nazis explicitly, consciously, openly took over the techniques of American commercial advertising and said so. They, you know, fuse a few simple ideas, stress them over and over, make them look glamorous. That was American commercial advertising in the 1920s. And it was the model that the Nazis explicitly adopted. And it's the model of business propaganda today. So yes, the Obama phenomenon, I think, reflects the same alienation of the population that you find in polls which say every large 80% say the country is run by a few big interests. Well, Obama says we're going to change that. There's no indication what the change is going to be. In fact, you know, the financial institutions, which are his major contributors, think he's fine. So no indication of any change. But if you say change, people will grasp. You say change and hope, people will grasp and say, okay, maybe this is the savior who will bring about what we want, even though there's no evidence for it.
Sure,
so
sure,
I think the Obama phenomenon and the alienation go hand in hand.
Would you see any difference, let's say, between a McCain administration
I think so.
or Obama administration?
Well, McCain is another example of the very effective propaganda and creation of imagery. I mean, if suppose there was some Russian pilot who was bombing civilian targets in Afghanistan and was shot down and tortured by the American-run Islamic fanatic terrorists there, would we say he's a war hero? Would we say he has he's an expert in strategic and security issues because he was a bomber bombing civilian targets? No, we wouldn't. But that's the image that's been created of McCain. His heroism and his expertise in strategy comes from the fact that he was bombing people from 30,000 feet and shot down. You know, not nice that he was tortured. Too bad. It shouldn't happen. Crime and so on. But it doesn't make you a war hero or a specialist in foreign policy. That's all public relations creation. I mean, the public relations industry is a huge industry, very sophisticated. I mean, probably something like a sixth of gross domestic product goes into marketing, advertising, marketing techniques, and so on. And that's a core element of the society. That's the way you keep people separated from one another, subdued, focused on something else, and explicit. As I say, it's all discussed in the public relations propaganda.
Sure. But going back to the question is, would you see any difference in terms of foreign policy?
Yeah, I think McCain is maybe worse than Bush. He doesn't say much because you're not supposed to say much about issues, but the few things he's had said are pretty frightening. He could be a real loose cannon.
Yeah, that might explain the sympathy that Europe has towards Obama as a way of sort of stopping.
Well, I think that, Europe, actually the American establishment itself was afraid of Bush.
Yeah.
Bush came under unprecedented criticism from right in the mainstream. Mm-hmm. For example, when his national security strategy was announced in September 2002, calling for preventive war, virtually announcing a war in Iraq. Immediately, within weeks, there was a major article in Foreign Affairs, the main establishment journal, condemning what they called the new imperial grand strategy, and not on principled grounds, just that it would be harmful to the United States. And right through, there's been a lot of criticism. And the Bush administration, it's a very narrow spectrum of policy, but they're way at the extreme, if not off the extreme, of radical nationalism, extremist radical nationalism. And McCain is probably in the same territory. Obama very likely would move back to the center-right, where the Clinton administration was. It's called the Democratic Leadership Council, sort of a center-right grouping, not extreme, more pragmatic in its dealings with people. Actually, the Bush doctrine itself is an interesting example. The so-called Bush doctrine of preventive war, brazen contempt for even allies and so on. The doctrine itself was not new. Actually, Clinton's doctrine was even worse, taken literally. Sure. The Clinton's doctrine officially was that the United States has the right to use force to protect access to markets and resources. I mean, that's more extreme than Bush. But they presented it politely, quietly, not in a way that would alienate even allies, so the Europeans could pretend they didn't hear it, Of course they knew it, and in fact probably approved of it, the European leaders. But the Bush doctrine, the arrogance and brazenness and extremism and ultra-nationalism of the Bush administration, that did offend the center, the mainstream center, and Europe. So yes, they'd like to see someone more polite following the same policies.
Now, do you see room for the left in the United States at some point, and how that would come up?
I think this country ought to be an organizer's paradise. I mean, if you look at public opinion, which is very well studied, it's remarkable. So, I mean, on the issues where you've done the main work, on health program, I don't talk about it. If we had a functioning democracy, the United States would have had a national health care system decades ago. The public's always wanted it. The same is true in foreign policy. I mean, take, say, Iran, the next big issue coming along. The public has every presidential candidate, including Obama, says we must maintain the threat of force against Iran, keep the options open. It happens to be in violation of the UN Charter, but this is an outlaw state, so nobody comments on that. But not the public. A large majority of the public says we should not have threats, we should enter into diplomacy. The public holds that large majority, like 75%, that Iran has the rights of any signer of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, the right to enrich uranium for nuclear power, but not nuclear weapons. And strikingly, a very large majority of the public thinks that we should support a nuclear weapons-free zone in the region, including Iran, Israel, American forces deployed there, and so on. That happens to be Iranian official policy. And in fact, the United States is committed to it if you look formally at what it signed. But no candidate could even mention this possibility. If the United States were a functioning democracy in which public opinion influenced policy, this issue would probably be settled. Many others too. Take, say, Cuba. I mean, for 45 years, the United States has been dedicated to punish Cubans. We have the internal documents from Kennedy and so on. You got to punish the Cuban people because of what they called the successful defiance of U.S. policies going back to the Monroe Doctrine, 1823. The Monroe Doctrine established the U.S. right to run the hemisphere. The Cubans are successfully defined. What does the public think? I mean, polls have been taken since the 1970s. About 2/3 of the public says we should enter into normal diplomatic relations with Cuba. It's just the way the rest of the world does. But the extremist fanaticism of the establishment that includes the whole spectrum here. Kennedy is the one who started it. You won't hear of it, and no political candidate will ever mention it. And the same is true on a host of issues. So, as I say, it should be an organizer's paradise. I think the possibilities for the left are extraordinary. And that's one of the reasons for the clamping down on opinion, on expression of attitudes, and so on. And in fact, it is a pretty activist population. So if you, there are more people involved in activism on one or another serious issue today than in the 1960s. It's just kind of subdued. And there are many popular movements now which never existed in the past. I mean, take, say, the solidarity movements with the Third World. That's something totally new in the history of European imperialism. And it came from mainstream America in the 1980s. There were rural churches, evangelicals, right from the mainstream. Thousands of people were going to Central America to live with the victims of Reagan's terrorist wars, to help them, to try to protect them. Maybe a white face will protect them, and so on. And there's just thousands or tens of thousands of people. Actually, one of my daughters is still there in Nicaragua. But this never happened in the history of imperialism. I mean, nobody from France went to live in an Algerian village to help to protect them from, French atrocities. It wasn't even an option. Nobody considered it. But in the 1980s, it developed spontaneously, not in the elite centers. So you didn't find it in Boston, but you did find it in rural Kansas and Arizona. And it's now spread all over the world. So you have Christian peacekeepers in Hebron, in other words. Or the global justice movement that developed here, what's called ridiculously anti-globalization. The propaganda says that it began in Seattle. It didn't begin in Seattle, it began in the Third World. But if hundreds of thousands of Indian peasants storm the parliament, that's not a fact. If some people do something in a northern city, that's a fact. So the mass popular movements in Brazil and India and so on, they didn't exist until a northern city became involved. But it did become involved. And it's now spread over much of the North as well as all over the South.
And speaking about this, in terms of the anti-globalization movement, has been a splendid movement, but at the same time there's a feeling that maybe it's stuck. And in that respect, what do you think about the idea of establishing a fifth international or some form of organization that could come up with an alternative to the current order and system?
Well, I've talked at the meetings of the World Social Forum, which are always in the South, and I've mentioned that. I said, it seems to me that this might be the seeds of a real international, and in my view, the first international. I mean, what was called the First International was important, but it was very localized. It was parts of Europe, and it was essentially destroyed by Marx when he couldn't control it. The Second International collapsed before the Second World War. The Third International was taken over as a propaganda institution by the Soviet Union, and the Fourth International was marginal Trotskyite. But this is the first authentic international, or at least the seeds of it. Not just the World Social Forum, but take, say, the Via Campesina. Last time I went to Porto Alegre in Brazil to go to the World Social Forum, the first place I went was to the international meeting of the Via Campesina, the International Peasants Organization. Very lively, very exciting. This represents most of the population of the world, and it was really exciting to be there. The World Social Forum as well. I mean, this is authentic globalization. These are people from all over the world, all parts of life, interacting, discussing, and going back and trying to implement ideas about social change. I think it'll fail. It's too early, but its failure will raise the level of action for the next try. So I think it makes sense what you say, that it is maybe the seeds of the first authentic international, the United States and elsewhere, feeling that the institutions don't work for us. They work for someone else, for themselves. Perception which is accurate. And if that can coalesce and be organized and move to use the freedom that we do enjoy, that's a very significant prospect.
One thing that in Europe is very worrisome is the Americanization of the European politics, which I assume that is happening everywhere. And even the left has lost its language. For example, even left-wing leaders do not speak about working class. They speak about middle class. Class struggle has completely disappeared, things like that. So there is a very worrisome development where the American language is now appearing in Europe, and that goes side by side with the enormous weakness of the left. That Americanization seems to be paradoxical, because at the same time United States influence is going downhill. Here you see Europe that is becoming more and more American in terms of the politics. Political parties have lost its potency and value. Rather than political parties, particularly left-wing parties, became sort of personalities with media networks, and politics became a show, a theatrical show, as you said at the very beginning. Slogans came up without any meaning. How do you explain that at the time that America is declining, the United States is declining, the cultural and political values and meaning of the United States establishment is becoming very dominant?
Well, that's a large topic, but just to sort of pick a few elements of it. If you look over a longer historical sweep, Europe was the most savage and brutal region of the world for centuries. Establishing the nation-state system in Europe, arrogance of the most extreme kind. I mean,